everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our 2022 Women's World Banking, Making Finance Work for Women series. My name is Sarah Buitoni, Director of Leadership and Diversity at Women's World Banking. Before I dive into today's session, I wanted to share a few key points as we get started. First, please be aware that this event is being recorded. Second, you'll notice everyone's microphones are muted and cameras are off. This is intentional to keep the focus on our speakers today. Third, if you should experience any technical issues, please reach out to the email you see on your screen, and we will do our best to assist you. Fourth, we will be hosting a Q&A near the end of the webinar. To elevate questions to our speakers, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And finally, I'd like to extend a special thank you to last year's MFWW sponsors. Without these founding supporters, broadening our thought leadership into a digital series would not have been possible. Thank you to our leading sponsor, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, our advancing sponsor, Ernst & Young, our broadening sponsors, Boston Consulting Group, the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, the European Investment Bank, and Facebook. Our supporting sponsors, Diebold Nixdorf, ARD Financial Group, White & Case, and Novi. We are also grateful for the ongoing support of our core funders for enabling our strategy, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and Visa Inc., and our contributing partner, FinEquity. So I'd like to start the conversation today with some context for why we are discussing this topic, how to engage men in finance to increase gender diverse leadership. Women's World Banking plays a key role in promoting diversity in the financial inclusion ecosystem. One of the ways we do this is by investing directly in developing women leaders through our signature Women in Leadership programs. However, we also recognize that investing in women's professional development isn't enough. Organizational systems, policies, reward structures, and cultures also need to change. Top decision makers, board members, CEOs, central bank governors, and senior managers have to not only buy into the value of gender equity, they also have to take meaningful action to eliminate structural biases and change mindsets. And in our world of financial services, the majority of these leaders are still men. In previous sessions of the Making Finance Work for Women discussion series, we've gotten a lot of audience questions asking, how do we better engage men in the conversation around women's leadership? Or how do I, as a man, do more to advance gender equity? We look forward to digging into those questions today during our panel and the Q&A that follows. At Women's World Banking, we believe that fully including and leveraging the contribution of women as members of the workforce, as leaders, and in the financial system is the right thing to do, and it also brings measurable economic benefits. There have been many research studies demonstrating the business case for gender diversity. It's associated with a more productive workforce, better service to a diverse customer base, and can help companies attract and retain top talent. Diverse teams make better quality decisions and are more innovative. And having more women in senior management is correlated with increased profitability, above average financial returns, and enhanced risk management. We've seen progress, but it's not enough. According to Oliver Wyman's Women in Financial Services 2019 Index, there were 20% women on executive committees in major financial services firms globally, compared to 16% in 2016. This progress is too slow, and it's currently under threat. the pandemic, compared to 3% of men's employment. And a recent study from McKinsey revealed that 1 out of 4 women in the US was considering leaving the labor force. As we grapple with persistent gaps in the pipeline, gender pay disparity, and the fallout of the pandemic on women who are more likely to take on additional care labor, both and are disproportionately struggling with burnout, I believe we need to shift our thinking about diversity and inclusion, not as a women's issue, not as a men's issue, but as a systemic issue. A question I'll leave you with today is, what can business leaders, the majority of whom are still men, do to enact system change that improves gender equity for everyone? We know from our work designing financial products and advocating for inclusive policy environments that there is no such thing as neutral. When you don't design with women in mind, you design for men. The same is true when designing mobile phones, car safety features, and space missions, and it's true in designing organizations as well. I know that our panel will provide great insights into how men can engage more in changing the structures and systems that disproportionately burden or exclude half of the population by sharing challenges they and their companies have grappled with, promising practices to make the workplace more diverse and inclusive, and strategies for engaging all voices to accelerate change. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator and my colleague, Harsha Rodrigues, Executive Vice President of Regional Client Services at Women's World Banking.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Harsha Rodrigues, and I lead client services at Women's World Banking. Welcome to our first Making Finance Work for Women webinar in 2022. We have a fantastic lineup of panelists today to dive into this critical topic of engaging men in finance to increase gender diverse leadership, a topic that many of you had raised with us last year. So let me start by introducing our panelists to you. We have with us Dr. Nannette Hechler-Fayd'herbe. Nannette is Head of Global Economics and Research and is the Chief Investment Officer of International Wealth Management at Credit Suisse. Nannette is the force behind some excellent research reports that focus on women in the workplace as well as gender diversity. And you can find links to 2 reports, Gender 3000 and Women and Work After COVID, in the chat. Welcome, Nannette. Next, let me introduce you to Uzoma Dozie, CEO of Sparkle. Uzoma is a serial entrepreneur. He led Diamond Bank in Nigeria, now Access Bank, and went on to establish a mobile-first digital bank called Sparkle, targeting underbanked individuals in Nigeria with financial services. Gordon Peters is our 3rd panelist, also from a startup. Gordon and his co-founder launched Boost Capital in Cambodia to enable cheaper and more convenient access to digital credit provided through a digital platform. Gordon's background is in consulting, in technology, social enterprises, and he has deep expertise in Southeast Asia. And last but by no means least, we have James White, an expert in human capital management. James consults with Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 financial services firms. He was the first head of diversity and inclusion at a couple of large asset management companies where he was tasked with building culture competency and credibility in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So welcome, everyone. Sarah's opening has set us up well to dive right in. One statistic, one data point that she cited that caught my attention is that 80% of board seats are still held by men. So while we've made progress over the last few years, it's still slow. And at the rate that we're going, at the pace at which we're going, estimates suggest that it could take us more than 2 centuries to achieve economic gender parity. So Nannette, help us get started. Explain to us, tell us from your perspective, what are some of the barriers and biases that continue to exist that are contributing to this gender leadership gap in finance?
There we go. Thank you, Harsha. two things, two observations as a practitioner, as well as an analyst in this field. Certainly the fact that we are starting off from a position where there are not very many women in certain areas of finance. I'm really making the point about certain areas because it depends very much from region to region how prevalent women are in finance institutions, and then also from area to area. Finance is a very broad range, has a very broad range of jobs. Per type of job. But to start with a relatively low share of women in finance means that many women actually lack role models. And when they are not able to find a reassurance that women can be successful in certain areas of finance, that this is an area where they can thrive, then it is also more difficult to attract women. So in some sense, it is about trying to make a segue into to have more role models. And how do you do that in a sector that in certain areas, and I'm going now to focus specifically on asset management, actually working with money, as opposed to working with relations. So women tend to have affinity, and this is shown in a lot of studies around women's preferences with studies. They do have affinity with jobs and occupations that have a lot of connection to people and to relations rather than to things, and especially money. We can see in many instances that women, whether they're investors or whether they're professionals, don't like to work with money. And so there is also the point about how do you actually make the connection element more prevalent in financial jobs. For example, emphasizing things like teamwork, something that is resonating when hiring, but also some of the values that are important typically to women professionals. So here's a couple of avenues that have built on my observations, but also on research that we have been writing on.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And Uzoma, from your perspective, you're working in a different market. Are you seeing some of these same biases play out in Nigeria? Is this your experience? And I'd also like to understand, given the pandemic that we've recently been living through, are you seeing new biases that have been exposed, new barriers that women are up against? Has the pandemic exacerbated any of these?
Thanks, Harsha, for the question. I mean, so I'll start from the last bit. I don't think the pandemic has especially with COVID, has made a difference, and that reason is, should I say, we know less now, and the reason for that is because a lot of businesses, especially in financial sector, have now moved from either full office working to remote or hybrid type. And so in a way, I would say, interestingly, it actually helped a way because it removes some bias, especially when it comes to you're looking for skills now, especially you're looking for skills. And you really, since you're not going to see the person and there's not going to be any interactions in the office, whether they're male or female doesn't actually really matter as well. So that's one plus, but it's not really, it's in very, very few organizations. Those biases, so like COVID, I mean, the biases are still there, and there are many biases. And what Nannette said, I mean, what Nannette's points resonate, especially in Nigerian context. You find, and the problem for women are in different stages. The women at senior management and the women at just coming into the organization. There are different sets of problems. In the first set of, for the women at the top of the business, their issues are related to their peers, to even to and even to society, and then even the infrastructure at large of the country. I'll give you an example. Today, for example, the Senate, the House of Assembly, which is the lawmakers, stopped a bill from going that would allow women the same rights to pass on being a Nigerian citizen. So if a woman marries a foreign person, she can't pass on that nationality. But if a man does, and we're in the 20th century, 21st century, and this is still happening. And so there are infrastructural challenges in Nigeria still that are very hard to remove, because the leadership is still dominated by men who think in a different way. We're talking about, baby boomers generation and all. In a country where you have most of your population is actually Gen Z, millennials and Gen Zs. So there's a disbalance between leadership and people who are actually in the country. And so that would affect diversity, that will affect gender, and that will also affect even generational, that you now begin to see even generational biases as well. So so at Sparkle, what we try to do is to create an enabling environment that allows for not just gender, but also ethnic and generational diversity. Because in our business, you have the younger generation that are actually the spenders, and the older generation who are the savers. So you need a combination of both in your ecosystem. And so it means that your internal ecosystem must have an environment that allows for this, or else your business, right, would be sub-optimized, especially in a country where you have 50% women and 50% men. And so the organization, so like for us, for Sparkle, it's how do we ensure that we have more women coming into the business, especially when we're a tech-driven business, and women in tech are very, very small. And so that problem has to be solved from a medium to long term. And so what role is Sparkle playing by sponsoring a lot of initiative about bringing women into technology. That's for the medium to short term. And in the short term, we're now ensuring that, like if we're hiring for risk management, we're hiring for any other like marketing, we want to make sure that, that women that it's women first before men, so that we have a diversity balance in the organization. And of course, at the women, and then we also know that, and finally for women, there's also that cultural issue. And so like if you're married or you have children, you have those pressures, and your support system is limited. So at Sparkle, we try to, like, simple things like, when we have events, we try to bring everyone, their family around, so that people can see how diverse the organization is and what the benefits are, not just for the people that work in Sparkle, but for the person's families and dependents.
Yeah, so both you and Nannette mentioned, the difficulty of bringing women into certain sectors. In your case, you've talked about technology. There are just fewer women that have the specific skill set. Nannette, you talked about as well, in certain aspects of asset management. Women just tend to gravitate more towards relationship-oriented roles rather than very sort of transactional, money-oriented roles. How do we start to change and overcome that, right? What are some of the things that we can do? Gordon, what is your experience? You work in a market like Cambodia. There are a whole bunch of societal systemic issues that, we deal with. What have you seen in Cambodia that's working, that continues to be a challenge? Any insights there that you could share for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. Yeah, just a background context coming into the question. I co-founded Boost Capital with a great co-founder, Lucinda Ravel, who's a mom of 3 kids, and during the COVID pandemic, went from kids in school to kids at home using Zoom to kids at home not able to use Zoom, so doing homeschooling. And so certainly that progression was followed closely by me and other team members that had similar problems of like household experiences went up. So I think I kind of agree with Uzoma on this, that in some senses there could be a little bit more of a bias in that household responsibilities went up, but in some senses it was sort of gender balanced to that. Like both males and females on our team had more childcare responsibilities and more other responsibilities that sort of went up. And so that I think that there could be some more flexibility that resulted as a result of that, where I know drop-off times for our head of product, for Lucinda, my co-founder, for our operations manager. I think it Boost, we certainly looked at that and thought about it and said, okay, let's increase flexibility. Work from home is something that it needs to be a thing for everybody, and then migrating into either that or hybrid going forward. Increase communication, and then focusing on the most important things of what's getting delivered rather than other things. So I think it can actually, some of what we've learned over the last couple of years could turn this in from a disadvantage to an advantage. I think we have now flexible working hours and non-office working spaces, and we think that that can lead to happier teams post-pandemic. Certainly, I think that the things that we're doing that seem to be working, I'd love to share and love to learn also from other people that are on this call. At Boost, from the very beginning, we tracked and reported to our investors gender balance at the board level, at the senior management level, and then at the team level. And so I think it's what you track, you do. And so I think that tracking has been useful. It's definitely a criteria for hiring and for promotions. It's not the criteria, but it's definitely a criteria that's in the mix for gender balance and generally inclusiveness. And then we also track our customers at a gender disaggregated view. And so I think that each of those have been valuable for us to sort of answer this question of gender equity. And certainly the last one of tracking our customers gender disaggregated, we're 60% female customers, 40% male customers. How would we do a good job of serving those customers if we're a male only team? So I think it varies front and center once you start to track your customers, that there's things you should be doing and thinking about. But those are the main experiences that I wanted to bring to the table.
Yeah, thanks. I think you raised two important points. I mean, one is, given the pandemic and the issues around the pandemic, I think what I'm hearing you say that there's much greater awareness of, the issues that are facing both men and women, and a greater appreciation for what's been happening. And that this actually might provide the fact that, we've all gone through it together, might provide a greater sensitivity to issues, going forward. And I guess the second point that you raise is data, gender disaggregated data, which is critical in really trying to understand both internally within the organizations as well as externally with your customers. Once you have that breakdown, what you need to do, what metrics you need to set up, where you have gaps, where you need to do more. That brings me to some of these issues that we're seeing within organizations that are more structural, like inability to collect this data. Factors that exist that still contribute to disproportionate impacts on women. Turning to you, James, how do you see this play out? I mean, you've heard your co-panelists speak to some of the challenges that they've seen. How do you see this come into play with large organizations? You've worked with big asset management firms, a lot of the Fortune 100, 500 firms. How have you seen that play out? What have you seen there that leaders should be looking out for?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And it's such an interesting topic. I think that this is really true for large organizations. Back when I worked at Merrill Lynch and, Bank of America, Credit Suisse as well, some of the smaller shops, which is where I've been occupying the last few years of my career. One of the things that's really common, I think, is that, we went into, before the pandemic, there were stats around the time it would take to achieve gender parity in our organizations. There was research out there that looked at the experience of women in the workplace. And there were also a lot of stats that said at that time, pre-pandemic, the pandemic was not even on the radar there, that there was some burnout with a lot of women executives in terms of trying to climb that corporate ladder as well as trying to manage their homes. And so one of the things I think is what we really need to take stock in is the fact that, we went into the pandemic, with women not always winning. Now we've had 2 years, 2 very, very painful years. And although we are moving into that endemic stage, and that feels positive, I like when I hear business leaders on the news or journalists on the news talking about the next phase, I still think, we're not behind. The COVID pandemic is not behind us in terms of the impact on our psychology. And so I think one of the things that what we really need to do, there's so many things that, strategies before the pandemics, some of them had great success in terms of recruiting and things like, bringing women back into the workplace who, had been away for a number of years, taking care of their loved ones, children, or aging parents. I think we need to really take this time to really step back and really kind of understand the experience of a lot of women and other underrepresented communities as well. And to figure out how we can better create a workplace for them. And it's an interesting thing when you really look at talent right now too. You know, there's an article I just read. I'm really glad we talked about that McKinsey article, because if you haven't read that, I'm going to repost it again in a minute. Has got some really incredible insights in terms of the experience of women. But it's also, you know, when you really start to study the talent landscape and what happens to people, you know, there's a great article just this past week in The Atlantic, and it's called "What You Find When You Leave Your Job." I'll post that as well. But it's really interesting because as we're seeing more women leave the workplace the last couple of years, sometimes just to take care of home, which is a huge job all by itself. Some women who also, even before the pandemic, were starting to lean more toward leaving the company and starting their own businesses. You know, I think there's something that happens to you when you step outside of our corporate cultures and you have time to reflect on what makes you happy. It may or may not be that job you left. It may be something different. So I think we really have to understand like what's happening with our talent landscape, and also, you know, how are we going to really reapproach retention strategies, because you can't have the same retention strategies that apply to an employee base that is still changing dramatically every day because of what's happened with the pandemic. And I would say too, you know, with what's happening in the Ukraine right now, this is another level of stress, right, for a lot of people, which that kind of stress also drives people, their psychology, drives their anxiety, it drives performance, all that has impact on performance, all those things. So I think one of the most important things I think we need to do now is certainly think about what has worked in our organizations, but also take the time to reapproach the talent, which is changing so much every single day, and make sure that we're meeting their needs.
And James, how do you suggest any tips, advice in terms of how we do that, in terms of, you know, how you approach talent and how you look at, you know, acquisition, retainment strategies, retention strategies, anything you've seen, you know, in the work that you've done?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the most important things you could do is stay connected to people. You know, there's this concept of oversharing. We're not really talking about that, but there is the idea that, you know, if I have somebody on my team who has 3 children, I should know that. I should probably know their ages. I should probably ask questions around, you know, what are the days that your son or daughter has a baseball game? I mean, because I know that's a day that you need to leave early. I'm not going to schedule big meetings on that day, or the morning of the next day. I'm going to work with that. And so I think one of the strategies I think that has been so helpful is really started to change the mindset over the last 2 years has been the idea that we need to do more to connect. And that applies to a small company as well as a large company, because even in a large company is made up of, you know, thousands of small teams. And so this idea of understanding, you know, the personal life, you know, or whether you're caring for aging parents or whatever that is, I think the idea is to really ask a lot more questions and to listen. And I think that applies not just to current employees, but to people who you're recruiting as well, and creating that dialogue with them to understand, you know, what their needs are, what their expectations are in terms of flexibility, in terms of, you know, their policy, in terms of, you know, vacation policy, those kinds of things. There is, I will tell you though, more than ever before, just like the McKinsey study, I'll tell you there's more than ever research just about everywhere you look. You know, when we talk about 30 years ago, I wasn't doing this work 30 years ago, but about that, a lot of this research around the talent landscape was really inside the university kind of sector. And, you know, right now you can't open a Wall Street Journal, which, by the way, a lot of our male leaders read regularly, right? Especially in financial services, they probably look at it, you know, several times a day. You know, you can't really open up a Wall Street Journal without seeing something about diversity, about women leaving the workforce, about, you know, women of color specifically, because, you know, and their unique experience in the workplace. So I think when we talk about leaning in, and that's an interesting concept separately, but what we need our male leaders to do is to really seek out, because it's everywhere, but create that practice within yourself so that you are reading this resource that's out there, because you just about can't get away from it. It's everywhere. You don't even have to Google too much to find it. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do, because there's the research itself often comes with things that you can do in your organization. So I think, you know, what we have to do is ask, you know, in terms of kind of reassessing, getting to know our talent landscape, I think we have to encourage men to really lean into the resource that's there, ask questions, talk about what they're reading with other men, and then think about how that translates into today's culture.
On that last point, I'd love to hear from the other panelists. I mean, you know, there's so much going on in the world, as you mentioned, you know, a war, we've been going through this pandemic. There have been, you know, a lot of competitive pressures that have come up. I mean, the global business landscape has changed so dramatically over the last couple of years. I mean, companies are facing competitive pressures. There's a whole bunch of operational challenges. In the midst of all of this, how do organizations continue to keep that focus on diversity and inclusion, and not have it be taken away and taken over by these other, areas? And I'd love to hear, Nannette, from you, from a very large organization, global, as well as from the startups, smaller organizations where you have more control, where you have, the ability to make change quickly. Would love to hear sort of both perspectives. Nannette, maybe you can get started to kick us off.
Well, I think first of all, it's important to realize that diversity is really also operational in the following sense. We have, for many years at Credit Suisse, we have invested in having a very good database of companies around the world that we are able to tier by the percentage share of women in their C-suites and in their boards, and analyze just simply how these companies are doing on a number of criteria. For example, profitability, when you look at how these companies are differing to one another in the various tiers in terms of EBITDA margins, for example, or how they are doing in terms of cash flow returns, or indeed how their share price is doing. And what we are finding, without asserting any causality, but it's simply the facts that on average, companies that have a higher share of women representation in C-suite and board happen to have the better profitability statistics, happen to have also the better equity performance. In fact, what we have called the gender alpha, that at least from the more than 3,000 companies that we have analyzed, is boiling down to an average 200 basis points, so 2% on average better return in the tiers, in the top tier, by share of women in the management, in the control, in the board, as opposed to the lower tiers with much lower shares of women. So what is important to keep in mind, especially in periods that are so exceptional by the way we are working and so forth, that it's really important to keep women, to keep that focus and that share also for operational purposes, because chances are that your company is just going to have decisions that are perhaps looked at from different angles. This is what diversity is bringing, is the difference of perspective that is helping to have also a more informed decision, perhaps better risk management, and in the end also better performance. So yeah, that's a very important point. And then in terms of just practical priorities, I think it's been very important what was already made in the discussion as an observation, that during the pandemic, both women and men needed more flexibility because simply of the environment. And that led men to realize what could be a typical day and a typical challenge for women. I think that it is a real opportunity as well to seize, to have that better understanding, and then facilitate a number of circumstances on the job for women to then, instead of just leaving a job, being able to stay and to go from one life cycle to the next.
Yeah. The business case is clear, absolutely, and I think there's greater awareness now, as you mentioned as well, in terms of the barriers women were facing earlier. For Uzoma and Gordon, I mean, when it comes to keeping that focus, how can men advocate for their companies to keep their foot on the pedal when it comes to diversity and inclusion? You both have launched, founded your organizations. What is the role that men can play in keeping this focus and engaging other men?
Okay, so I see it as a business case. So as a business imperative. So if your business is going to be sustainable, and your market, the market that we're playing in is 50% men and 50% women, and across different genders, then it's important that that you have an environment and process that actually aligns with that to attract the right people. And I mean, like as James said, you know, there's a changing competition for resources. So we're seeing a lot of, for example, we're seeing a lot of people who are working in big banks saying, you know what, I want a smaller, flexible, more homely place to come in. So they're looking at the fintechs or the companies that have more flexibility. We're also facing peer pressures from people saying, you know what, we also need, you know, I want to do something else than just work. I want to be entrepreneurial. And so you must now start creating those, like changing the way the organization approaches how people work. So in Sparkle, for example, you know, we allow people to have their own small businesses or their whole enterprises because we actually even think it's good for the business. We think that, you know, like you need an entrepreneurial spirit and mindset to work in Sparkle. And so if you have your own business or your own like thing that you're doing and you disclose it, it means that you can actually understand the customer's journey and play a bigger role in achieving this. Our office is not like an office. There's no like fixed desk. I mean, like the rooms are like parlors or lounges, and it has to be like that because I think people have gotten used to also working in their own remote, homely place. And if they're going to come to the offices or work at Sparkle, it has to be kind of similar. It has to be comfortable for mothers or, you know, or to be mothers or young people or older people. And so in creating that whole environment has to reflect that because we're actually facing a lot of pressure from not even only Nigeria but also outside Nigeria, and that's even the bigger problem. We're also seeing a brain drain where people are thinking, you know what, I want to go to an environment or a country that, you know, respects diversity, that gives me more equal opportunity, and if I'm not finding it in Nigeria, I'm going to go elsewhere. So even as businesses, I mean, it's our responsibility to play an active role in advocacy to making sure that even from a national level, there is gender equality, or else we will see further pressures from that space. So it is for us, it's being aware that it's not just our business, but you also have to play a wider role. Secondly, you know, metrics, you know, like we have to be deliberate. So we have to always look at the numbers, right? And those numbers also have to be part of our objectives. So it's not about profit anymore. Profit is short term. If you want long-term profit, you have to look at those metrics that makes this profit sustainable into the future. And so that's what we're trying to do at Sparkle.
Yeah, that's hugely innovative. The approach that you're taking in terms of allowing others, for example, to, you know, have their own businesses while they're working with you. The role in advocacy. I mean, it sounds like Sparkle can be a role model, you know, in the Nigerian market. Has that resulted in success in terms of acquiring more women, retaining more women? Has that, because in tech, as you mentioned, you know, it's hard to find more women than men, or, you know, equal numbers of women than men with that skill set. With this philosophy and approach, are you seeing, you know, the ability to have greater success bringing women in and keeping women in?
So look, we started operations a year ago, so it's early to tell. Well, the success story is that, first of all, I think we have more women working in Sparkle than men. So I think we're at 55-45% ratio, so that's good. And so and then we are also trying to make sure that we're very deliberate about the type of businesses that we have. We also want that diversity in our customer base. But the good thing about it is that at least if we have those numbers and if we can show what we're doing and the impact, it makes the conversation easier when we go to other like businesses and say, you know, this is who we are, this is what we've done, and this is why we think that we should choose us as a partner versus the other organizations that are not as diverse or, you know, as flexible as we are.
Gordon, any thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, definitely. I was going to jump in. I agree a lot of what Uzoma said there. I think that we're certainly benefiting from having diversity on our team, and I know that communicating with others about that is part of what we do in our day-to-day. I agree with James a lot on communication's key. Like if you do not know your team members' schedules for their kids' events and things like that, it's going to be harder to manage a team. It's going to be harder to schedule calls. Like I think that I'd be at a disadvantage if I didn't know when drop-off, pick-off times were for my team members. So I think that we built that into our company, and it is helping us to hire and retain. We've been building Boost for about 3 years now. We're in the midst of hiring a couple of new senior team members, and it's very useful that we've got a male co-founder and a female co-founder that are on the senior team and are making decisions. With the product manager, we're just in the middle of recruiting right now. It was a key question of hers straight out of the gate: what's the work-life balance, and how does it work at Boost? And so I think that it is something that is valuable for us as a company to have diversity in our DNA and be communicating about it.
Yeah. Would love to go a little bit deeper into this topic of, changing mindsets, right? That's what we're talking about. It's now really having mind shift, change, and driving action, because no matter, if companies have policies, mandates, in place, there's data that you're tracking. Ultimately, it's the individuals who make up an organization who have to genuinely buy in to these initiatives to, see real change happen. James, you worked in the past at Lord Abbett. It's a 93-year-old investment management company where women now make up 45% of the executive committee. That's a big accomplishment. That's a big feat. How did that happen? How did you all work towards that?
Well, one of the things I can share, and this is something that's true because I know it's true across companies who are doing this work really well, and because I study a lot of companies, not just obviously trying to put in to place change strategies at the organizations I've worked at in the past, but also in studying other companies. There are 5 different critical success factors that I kind of made notes on here. I want to make sure I kind of read them off to the group here, because I think these are the things that really set the landscape. Because all of us, of course, regardless of our role, all of us have work to do in the day-to-day, but a lot of this work, the majority of it really starts in the C-suite, specifically driven by the CEO. And so, in terms of critical success factors, when I look at this work, I think about the fact that this has to be, again, the companies who are getting it right, this has to be a part of the business strategy, right? This is not just a learning initiative. This is not something that's an add-on. It has to be a part of the business strategy. Along with that, the second point is you have to have goals tied to that business strategy. Right. This also, the work itself, the approach has to be embedded into the firm's values, very important. And then, of course, the fourth point I would make there is that this has to be a part of your performance management process, particularly at the top of the house with the CEO and his leadership team. So if it starts there, it's a part of the business strategy, the C-suite level, all of them are getting measured on the progress. This is how we're going to drive change. And then the last item there in terms of critical success factors is the thought leadership. So you need someone internally, whether it's a head of diversity, a chief diversity officer, whatever the title is, you need someone internally with access to the CEO to influence the CEO, who really understands a change management process. It's funny when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, sometimes we react to the passion that so many people, especially these days, have around gender equity. But that's different than having cultural change management expertise. Because this work there is a way to systematize this work through training, through the evolution of how we understand diversity, equity, inclusion, why it's important, what I can do as an ally, some understanding where things go wrong, and thinking about that journey, that sequence to where the organization is right now, when they start, whatever that is, whether they've been at it for 10 years or just now getting started, understanding where they are on that maturity spectrum, and then planning that through the goals, the 3 to 5 year goals, building that change management curriculum to get those goals, to the 3 to 5 year goals, through an internal thought leader who has both that change management experience, who has the passion, but also understands the landscape. I think these are the things when I study companies who are really doing this work well, these are the 5 common things I see in all of them.
So clearly a well thought through change management process to get to the results. Nannette, you work for a large global, bank as well. Has this been your experience? Are there lessons that you're able to share? And as our only woman leader on this panel, as a woman leader, any personal experiences or, lessons that you can share with the audience?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it takes really this determination that has to come from the top. And determination means, for example, when you're recruiting and hiring, that the recruitment process really is not even starting without having female as well as male and a diverse talent pool that is being regarded, and where then meritocracy absolutely is the merit of a position and a profile is then coming. But oftentimes it is so that companies, because they're maybe under under a time constraints, etc., just don't do this final step. So to making this something just standard is absolutely empowering. That's number one. Also, how to advertise for women, how to hire for women, to find the words that are attractive to women, making sure that women actually come and postulate for open positions is very important. So in the HR organization of companies, there is also affinity and sensitivity and research required to understand what is resonating with women candidates. Now, when it comes to retention, I do think that non-standard work models are absolutely critical, because what we see is that over the career, as women go from one seniority to a higher seniority and up the ladder, oftentimes this coincides with the typical life cycle of many women, where families are being created, where there is a draw on their resources for personal reasons. And so it's very important that companies embrace and include non-standard work arrangements, where I would make, however, the case that these non-standard work arrangements have to be available for both genders, for men as well as for women. Because what often happens when it is only women that are being encouraged to make use of those, they do fall back in terms of many of the things that lead to promotions that men then are simply having a better position from. So to have a more balanced, I in my team, to be very specific, do have part-time men and women who are working, and this is really putting both genders on an equal footing with respect to promotion. And then finally, I would say that also in terms of moving women to more top leaderships, it does require, I would say, mentoring and sponsoring programs. They don't need to be necessarily institutionalized, but many women do benefit from transfer of knowledge, transfer of experience by others, by role models. And so this has proven quite powerful as an enabler for women then to have also the right track in terms of how to build a career.
And on this last point, Nannette, do you see that men have to play a different role versus women? So men leaders versus women leaders, you know, in terms of, do you see in terms of how you have to engage other men to bring them along? Do you see that to be different if you're a woman leader versus a male leader? Engaging other men?
My experience has been, I have had in my own past as many men sponsors and supporters as I had also women, perhaps actually more men than women, because we are in an environment where simply the demographics are such that there were more men that ended up promoting and sponsoring me. No, I do think that it does simply require a state of mind, also a bit of a roadmap. Some leaders just simply don't realize how important some things are. So there is a good case to be made to also provide regular just refreshers of some of the things that are particularly helpful for women. And then also, frankly, the networks that women do create informally or formally in institutions, especially in big corporations. Networks are very important, because then there is a transfer of knowledge from some of the more experienced, more senior women to others that are more junior, and they're just learning how to take their fate in their own hands.
Uzoma, Gordon, what's your experience been on this particular piece? You know, men engaging other men, women leaders engaging other male leaders in advancing gender diverse leadership. What are some of your experiences over the years, not just at the startups, but even in other settings?
Yeah, I was going to jump in immediately and say, Nannette, the mentoring and sponsoring programs, I think, work at big companies and small companies. We, at the suggestion of one of our investors, launched a mentoring program for our female staff a year ago, and it's been great. It increases the communication between team members, increases relationships, and that's wonderful as we're growing. I think back to the question overall, Harsha, of how do you increase men's awareness and promotion of this? I think it's things like this. It's talking about it. It's getting the word out of it's important. As James said, it's in the newspapers. Like, it's hard to open the Wall Street Journal and not see it in front of you. But it is important to talk about it and talk about what you're doing and how you're doing it, what is working. I think that it is in communication like this that other people can get inspired to make movement, and that's what it is. It's realizing that there's a change management that's happening and being behind it and a forceful actor in it and that sort of thing.
Yeah, if I can interject just one second back to Nannette too, and I have to give Credit Suisse some kudos because when we talk about mentoring and sponsorship, Credit Suisse was one of the organizations in the early days of returnships who brought women into the organization. And I have to tell you, it was so interesting. I was one of the mentors on all those cohorts that went through, and I'm not sure if that program continues or not. But I'll tell you, one of the great things I learned, because with the women we brought into these cohorts who had been caring for family members, caring for children, was as a mentor, I learned so much from these women. I have to say that I don't know who got more out of the program, me and a lot of other male leaders as well, because what we got to do after building trust with these women was we got to learn what the experience of leaving the workforce was, what kind of anxieties did that create, what it was like to, care for children, how did they had their image of themselves change as they cared for children or whatever it was that took them out of the workforce. What are they nervous about returning into the workforce? I have to say I learned so much from them, and that has still fundamentally changed how I understand the experience of women at home and in the workplace. So those kinds of programs I think are so powerful.
Thank you. They're continuing.
I'm so happy to hear that. That's great. You made big news a few years ago, like real prime time stuff there. So congratulations on that still.
Great. So I know we need to wrap up before we go into Q&A. So one final question that I'll direct to all of you. If you could share just one piece of advice for the men in our audience today, if they could do one thing better to engage male colleagues to become allies in advancing gender diverse leadership, what would it be? Uzoma, could you get us started, please?
Well, I think it's telling your own stories, of how you have played a role in diversity and what the benefits, what the benefits to your organization have been, and to what it has been to you personally. And one way, many organizations, and when I think back and look at organizations, we have visions and mission statements and then values. And those mission and vision statements, that's one thing that we don't look at. How can we use those value systems, right, to drive diversity and to tell stories? So at Sparkle, we have 6 values. I think 5 of them can be diversity-based, like there's freedom, there's transparency, and things like inclusion. Now, you can tell stories around that, but and I think as a leader, one advice I give is that you must force a conversation that people don't want to have, especially in your organization. And so, I use my value systems to actually drive that conversation. And so, I started by saying, I know you guys don't want to talk about this because, people they're uncomfortable. It's like, but one of our values is transparency. And so, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's bring it out, because the more you talk about it, the more comfortable you are by engaging about it, and it becomes a normal conversation. I think that conversation is not normal yet, and so we need to make it normal by, bringing it out. And so look at what pillars or what structures can you use within your organization to actually continue to address that, so people can actually use that to have that conversation. And that would be my advice.
Great, thanks, James.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you just said. I think that's a great practice. One of the things, though, that I would encourage people to do, and this is something I don't know that we talk enough about in our organizations, is this concept of self-reflecting. And because you asked for things that men can do, right? Self-reflection in terms of the way in which we were socialized as very young men. And not just the way in which we were socialized, but also within the context of the years, within geographic location. I was a young man back in the mid-60s, early 70s, mid-70s, in the deep South in Tennessee. There was a lot happening in the news right now. I've spent a lot, in those times, I should say, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the men that I engaged with in those early years. what was going on in the environment around me. And by dissecting all of that, it's really helped me to understand what kind of man that I am, and also things I need to work on. And then that kind of self-reflection, I think, is not something that we as men spend enough time on, is understanding the very essence of how we were shaped and socialized in those early years, because it really is a big driver of the way that we approach a lot of this work now. And the part two of that really is, I'm going to give three here. The part two really is the reading, which I mentioned before. You know, when people make it a practice, you know, I actually do a lot of reading and research through the week, but this is my profession, something I care about. But I actually do monitor how much have I read, how many articles I get through this week, you know, how much time did I spend? Just like we have the Instagram counter in terms of how many hours you've been on Instagram. I have that same mental radar about how much work I've done each week. And then by Friday, if I've not done enough work that I feel is comfortable, then I'm going to cancel some stuff on the weekend, and I'm going to make sure that I make up. I'm going to get that time back on my research because it drives my reflection, and it also gives me a framework to be able to understand, how I, again, was socialized and how I behave today as a leader. And then, of course, finally, and I think this was mentioned before, which was to talk to other men about this. It doesn't matter whether they're champions, they're very mature, they're less mature, but to talk to other men, because I think you pointed this out before, it really is how we learn. So if we're doing the self-reflection, we're doing the research in a disciplined manner, and then we're talking to other men about this, I think those are the three things that will really help us to accelerate our efforts in this space as men.
Great, thanks. Gordon.
Yeah, I think some similar answers to the good ones that have come out already. But I think, I mean, for me, my gut sense, as soon as you asked the question, was be a good actor and be paying attention to this straight away. So like walk the walk, and then discuss with others. Like make sure that you are bringing up that conversation. But I think you've got to be taking it on yourself in order to be embedded in that conversation.
Nannette, you have the last word.
I think it would boil down to say just to be determined about it, because what I have seen is that where there is a will, there is a way. And so if men leaders are determined about making this sort of change, if they have, for example, imbalanced teams, then by deciding and being determined about changing it, they will find ways to find the talent that fits. They will find ways to put in place things that help it along the way, and they will find ways also to bring women up the ladder and be very successful for their businesses. That's as simple as it is.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to end it, right? Where there's a will, there's a way, so it can be done. And I guess on that note, we transition over to the Q&A portion of the session. Sarah is going to be helping us through this because there have been a number of questions that have come through in chat that I think she will address to different panelists. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, we've got a lot of great questions. The first is, if COVID has raised so much awareness amongst men about the need for flexibility, then why is the gender gap widening? And why are more women losing their jobs and picking up a disproportionate amount of care work, homeschooling? And in a similar vein, I'm going to add a question that asks, in an organization where work-life balance is not implemented, maybe there's a policy or people talk about it, but no one follows it. What's the impact of that, on working women? So I think both of these questions are pointing at the say-do gap. There's a lot of things we can talk about, but what are we actually doing as leaders, as organizations?
Shall I start?
Please, yes, please.
I think the first part of the question with respect to the gender gap now in terms of women and men leaving the workforce, especially during the pandemic, is going to be different from one region to the next. I am just going to take the US as an example, because in the US there has been experience during the pandemic of many states where schools were closed, and where this is really one of the reasons why women are dropping out of the the labor force, because the same way as in many families, the homework, etc., is often done by women. Now put that on a schooling base, and you will end up basically the mothers taking over the schooling thing. And oftentimes it boils down to how, I would say, the comparative advantages are being spread between two partners in a family. But in general, the openness of schools has been certainly one of the very important criteria of why there has been a gap between men and women actually leaving the force. Now, this is very different than in other regions where the point about schools has not been of the same importance. And I would just say it brings us back to the institutional setup. Today, it is still the case that in many partnerships, the tasks are being split according to who has the more advantages in something. And when you are thinking about two partners of which one has to drop off, you are automatically looking at who is earning the higher wage, who is in a position to support the family better, who is actually better at certain tasks. And that has been driving some of what we have seen. Now, the big thing is, how do we bring women back? And I have been very encouraged because we have made a study of the labor market to see that there is a rapid rebound. Women are coming back. And it is also about now making good on what we learned during the pandemic and trying to make sure that even beyond the pandemic, this is still being available to women. So the comeback policies now are very important in my view.
And Nannette, anything on those comeback policies that companies should be doing specifically, explicitly?
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think that everything that applied on just the non-standard work arrangements is still absolutely valid. I mean, to have on a permanent basis. So this is what we have been thinking about: the new ways of working. New ways of working is that we are combining home working and on-site occupancy working in those sectors where this is possible. I'm not saying that it's possible in all sectors, but certainly in the financial sector, it is possible. And to make that available on a permanent basis, where there is days in the week where everybody can work from home, and another part where everybody is on site, and to have that on a permanent basis. We have called that the new ways of working. It is making something like that, which was an exceptional situation, but very well tested and experimented during now sufficiently long time to make that permanent, but at the same time not think that you would be able to do something on 100% home working basis. That doesn't work too. So I think new ways of working is a very important element of bringing women back.
Yeah, if I can just add to that from the policy perspective too. I mean, one of the things I've advocated for years, whatever organization I work for, was the maternity leave policy. Because it's sort of like a one-size-fits-all policy. Some women need more time. Some babies are more healthy than others when they're born, and sometimes families need more time to adjust. There's so much going on there. So I think it's flexibility at the umbrella level. I think you're exactly right, but I also think flexibility then has to be applied to many different people in different ways. It shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all thing. And we talk a lot about mothers. I myself have talked about mothers probably 10 times a day when I've been speaking, but also there are single women too, women without children, or single parents. There's the needs of such a diverse community of people are so great. I think that we can really benefit from really understanding, asking lots of questions and listening, and then building those strategies that support them where they are when we can do that. And I think that there's been a notion over the years that it has to be more of a one-size-fits-all in terms of equality. And actually what's happening there is we're missing that opportunity to be able to create solutions for the individual as needed, so that we all win across the board. So I think understanding the needs is really important.
Great. Sarah, other questions?
Yes, there are some questions about, for example, is there a role supervisory authorities can play to influence culture change in FSPs, given their oversight role? For those that experience success, for example, James, you spoke about some of the success stories over your career. Were external factors an influence in that change process, resulting in increases in gender diversity?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about external factors, I think it's gotten broader now. When we talk about, when we talk about that topic, I mean, it's hard to talk about anything without talking about pre-pandemic, during pandemic and now endemic stage. So I wanted to say, take the COVID off the radar for a second. In the last 5 to 7 years before COVID, we were getting so much more. And that's, again, multiple companies, other companies I've studied and worked with over the years have gotten more and more external pressure from their clients to be all in this work and to show some progress. Not necessarily as a term of doing business, but in some cases. We used to talk about in 15 years ago, it was just all about the RFP stories. And the questions in the RFPs were somewhat benign. And then we started to see those changes, 3 to 5 questions. We started to see those RFPs then evolve into multi-page, 25, 30-page documents. People have actually had entire jobs that are dedicated full-time to completing RFPs because they've gotten so exhausted. And then we started to see that move into conversations. So at the conference table around what the organizations are actually doing, how we can collaborate more on change initiatives and drive some success. So I think the external factors are there, but I also think from the client perspective, but I also think more than ever before, the pressure there is from the talent pool, both internally and externally, to be responsive. And again, not sounding like a broken record, to really understand what individuals really need to thrive in the organization. And then to try to meet their needs. So I think there's pressure from all around. A lot of the research I've read over the years, especially with our millennial talent pool, is that they will come to work if they're not getting the flexibility they need or what they need to be successful, whatever that is, they'll just leave. And so we've had to respond to that. When I first got into financial services, we would hire investment banking analysts who would sit there over the weekend, 7 days a week, working. Maybe they were staffed on a project, maybe they weren't. Well, the message they sent to us is, we don't want to waste a beautiful summer afternoon. We're actually just going to go to another firm that lets us have the weekend off unless we're staffed. That was a huge change. And we had to shift as an organization because we were losing them. So we started to build in more flexibility, different staffing guidelines on the weekends so that we could retain those people. But we were being responsive as an organization to the exit door. So many analysts leaving and not finishing that 2-year postgraduate time with us because they felt like their time was just being wasted and priorities ignored.
Thanks. I think I'm getting a cue here from my colleague that we're at time and we need to wrap up. So a sincere thank you to all of our panelists. I think this has been such an experience-rich and thoughtful discussion with brilliant nuggets of actionable insights for our audience. So really grateful for your participation. Thank you. And with that, I'll hand it over to Laxman Belbase, co-director of MenEngage Global Alliance, to provide the closing remarks.
Thank you. Really excited about this conversation, and thank you everyone for doing the work you are doing. And I'll just take 5 more minutes to sort of do a sort of wrap up on what I was listening to, and then also add points on what do we mean by when we talk about engaging boys and men. And I think one of the things that we do need to reinforce probably is that whatever we are now talking about, the root causes of the inequalities, the challenges we are talking is something which is male domination and which is around patriarchy. And also we need to realize that these financial institutions, let alone the economic paradigm, is heavily patriarchal. And these institutions that are set up there are hence very, very patriarchal oriented kind of institutions. So I think when we talk about gender diverse leadership or transforming these institutions to be equal, just, we have to also think about how can these institutions be transformed in a just way. So it's not about only talking about women putting into leadership in these patriarchal institutions in a way to turn women to be the patriarchs again, but rather transform the institutions so that it fits and it allows diverse gender leaders to come in. at all levels. So when we talk about leadership, generally we tend to talk about these executives and the decision-making level. But I think, the way we understand leadership now needs to redefine to be inclusive on in itself as a definition to include people across all the levels in an institution without taking into cognizance of all the people in the institutions, whether, when we look at the proportion of how many women are in the leadership role, we also need to start expanding leadership role to others beyond just executives and decision making, so that just having 50 or 55% of women at the executive and having 10% in the workforce of the institution won't really lead us to the kind of change we are looking into. And then when we talk about gender diversity or diverse leadership, we need to look into diversity from different levels. James brought up a little bit of that, but I also want to reinforce the fact that whatever we talk about leadership and institutions, many a times we get into this gender binary language, and we know we are in such a developed stage at that we are, the gender is not only the gender binary or men versus women. This is a spectrum, and there are different identities in the spectrum that we need to be cognizant of. And we know how LGBTIQ identified individuals or gender non-conforming individuals generally don't get into this kind of conversations, because the conversation on an sense is very gender binary, and hence leaving out a huge proportion of amazing talent pool that can help us transform these systems. And that's where I think the point about systems change needs to be there. And for this, when we talk about systems change, we need to talk about policies, recruitment, but also not only talk about bringing women back, but also think about how these institutions can retain women constantly on a basis, so that we don't need to even think about bringing back women or gender diverse leadership into the institution, but continuously have them with the system. And that's what I guess some of the spaces around the leadership needs to be rethought as well. Another thing, building on to, I think Uzoma brought it up, is we need to redefine and reestablish and question the concept of profit making in the financial institutions and finances and economy as a sector. The way we are understanding and defining profit, and the financial institutions understand and go and after this vision of becoming bigger, profitable and all, is not sustainable. We have to start questioning how do we understand these profits, and put human at the center, planet at the center, before the profit is in the board. Otherwise, we'll continue doing the same patriarchal kind of approach, and which will again discount the kind of vision and thinking that we are talking about right now. And when we talk about men, again, it's important to have men reflect on all of this again, because of the structure, the power and privilege that we as men occupy in this space, irrespective of our family or political landscape or public spaces. Men have always been there. So when we talk about engaging men, we need to realize that it's not that men were never in the picture. Men was always in the picture historically. But the question is, have we been engaging men on them rethinking and reflecting on the power, privilege, and the way they occupy the space, and how can we transform those space? And that's where the role modeling of men can come in, is how can we encourage men to be more flexible, more sensitive, more empathetic towards diversity, towards other avenues of areas, and then be humble about the kind of power privilege we hold, and then do the change management and about that in a different way. And I think that's really important. And then also last point is that let us also move away from tokenistic approach, that it's not only about plugging women but for the sake of saying we are diverse, but is that being done in a meaningful way is a bigger question. And we need to ensure that, I think Nannette talked about it, also is do that in a meaningful way. And then Gordon outlined one of the amazing example that he has been doing, but also consider, let us not also assume women as homogeneous population. Women or men or gender diverse individuals are heterogeneous. It's heterogeneous. We need to keep that diversity among women, among men, among individuals intact, so that we realize what do we mean by diversity. and then also look into the different kinds of diversity in institutional level, whether they're small institutions or big, large institutions, primarily the global institutions, based out of global north countries, and how that impacts the organizations in global south and smaller organizations, and what that means in its essence as a system-wide nature, and then make sure that it is more human and planet-oriented conversation. So with that, those are some of my reflections in terms of strengthening the focus on really envisioning the work or a vision around gender diverse leadership so that we can really make the transformation. And once again, thank you to everyone, and thanks to Women's World Banking for organizing this session. And I, who have been very critical of financial sector so far, was very impressed by the conversation that I was able to listen and be part of. And thank you to the people who have joined us, and sorry to keep you, maybe 6-7 minutes over the time, and probably back to colleagues at Women's World Banking. Thank you so much.